This debate is not about whether God exists or which religion is true. We are asked to imagine two different worlds, both of which have societies and individuals that believe in a divine being. The question that we must focus on in this debate is, which image of vision of God creates a better, more meaningful, and human world to live? Our side believes that a world where God sometimes does wrong things is a world of greater freedom and accountability that reduces oppression and human suffering. And especially from the perspective of a religious or potential believer who would be impacted in the most this debate, it matters deeply because the kind of God you believe in will shape how you live, love, and interpret suffering. Also, judge, in a world where God is always right, governments may use this perfect image to enforce rigid rules, suppressing critical thinking and turning humans into passive followers instead of active moral agents. In our world, religious narratives and messages depict God as one who may potentially face similar struggles and emotions like us. This means that they can make moral misjudgments and questionable decisions even with their omnipotence and supernatural powers. It may look like emphasizing stories that have existed today, such as the following. In Greek mythology, the gods were powerful yet imperfect with traits of jealousy, vanity, and impulsiveness. These stories were created by humans not because they worshipped cruelty, but because they understood that absolute power can be dangerous. Similarly, the story of Jesus in the desert emphasizes his human struggles and vulnerability. When he was tempted by the devil after fasting for 40 days, he experienced doubt, hunger, and exhaustion. These are not the kinds of stories that dominate how God is portrayed in the status quo or in the opposition side. Their world emphasizes a God who is all-knowing and all-powerful, whose decisions cannot be questioned because he's always right. But that depiction creates a gap in relatability and accessibility, stripping away the most inspiring and universal message behind all religions, the call to be kind, compassionate, and empathetic. And one preemption before I move on. They can say that a fallible God creates more confusion and chaos. First, the confusion is not necessarily harmful. When people are uncertain, they are more cautious and more reflective. Second, this is not a unique harm on our side. More ambiguity already exists even in a world where God is seen as perfect. Countless religions, denominators, and sects already interpret God differently. The opposition cannot claim moral clarity even when the same scriptures are read in opposing ways. Third, what truly causes moral progress is dialogue and reflection, not obedience. A fallible God creates room for moral reasoning, accountability, and continuous improvement rather than passively accepting God's rule. Now, moving on to our main argument, which is about why an imperfect God creates a more human and inspirational faith. When God is capable of mistakes, he becomes more human and people can relate to him, and faith becomes a relationship based on understanding and compassion, not fear and blind obedience. In a world where God can be wrong, believers no longer feel detached from the divine. They can identify with God's moments of error, doubt, or emotion, just as humans feel anger, love, and regret. This familiarity that deepens faith because followers connect to a divine being that mirrors their struggles rather than standing infinitely above them. This also allows believers to feel less betrayal and more redemption. Currently, people often lose faith after tragedies and feeling that God betrayed them, but in our world where there is already the common belief and expectation that gods can make mistakes, the relationship between the believer and the God becomes more redemptive. This means that instead of immediately abandoning their faith and becoming hopeless, people can adapt and seek more understanding through a constant reinterpretation of why God can possibly have allowed such tragedies happen. Additionally, there is also a greater human growth and choice on our side. A fallible God shifts focus of moral decision making back to humanity. People cannot simply just say God is right, so I must obey, but they should do so critically. What this means is that instead of just being blind dependence on obedience on religion and God, people have to distinguish between divine flaws from human limits and take responsibility for certain actions and events that they have direct control over. Comparative here, the worst case for our side is that some people may lose belief in God altogether, but even that is not inherently harmful. When divine stories are no longer resonate, people turn instead to human moral role models, examples of kindness, justice, and goodness they can see in others. This encourages open moral discourse rather than submission to divine absolutism. Therefore, our side is stronger because religious messaging becomes more relatable and accessible. A more human-like life filled with some mistakes and moments of weaknesses serves not only to inspire others but also to foster genuine growth within the boundaries of reality. This stands in contrast to blind obedience, often promoted and exploited by certain religious organizations and leaders so proud to propose. Thank you.
So this debate is not about proving whether God exists, nor is it about comparing which religion is better or truer. Both sides must assume a world where people believe in a divine being, but the real question is what kind of divine being creates a better world? From the opposition side, we believe that a world where God is always right provides a moral foundation that is stable, consistent, and protective of humanity's faith and moral order. It is a world where people can trust that morality truly matters and that goodness isn't just a personal opinion, but is guided by a clear and unchanging standard. In our world, God is morally perfect. His actions and judgments are always aligned with what is ultimately just and good. even when human beings cannot fully comprehend them. This does not eliminate human free will. People still make choices, mistakes, and moral reflections, but what makes our world different is that God serves as a constant and reliable moral compass. Although different religions interpret divine will in different ways, the main idea of divine perfection is based on shared moral values like respecting life, promoting justice, showing compassion, and improving society. And this means that on our side, a God who is perceived as perfect is idealized as a force that reduces suffering and promotes peace. Even if this hope is not always fulfilled, it remains important in supporting accountability and reinforcing the expectations of goodness both within the society as a whole and among religious institutions. In contrast, the government's role is one where God becomes an object of distrust. They claim that divine mistakes make God more human and relatable, allowing people to aspire toward goodness through shared imperfection. But this logic destroys the core purpose of religion. Religion was never meant to make God just like us. It was meant to guide us towards something greater, even if it may feel extremely difficult or even impossible. Note that the government cannot run away by broadly talking about the importance of role models that are similar to human beings. This is not a unique benefit, as human role models can also exist on our side. The point of divinity is to provide something that exceeds those limitations as a source of moral direction and hope that humanity cannot find within itself. This is the likely counterfactual of the government's role. When God is imperfect in their sight, his authority becomes fragile and inconsistent. People begin to describe his intentions based on personal bias or social pressure, leading to confusion and the rise of self-serving institutions that claim to reinterpret morality in God's place. And to move on to the main argument, even if divine perfection of God may seem like a restriction of freedom, it actually protects morality from human corruption and institutional chaos. There are a few reasons as to how this happens. Firstly, when people assume that God is perfect and morally absolute, no human can claim to be God or to hold equal moral authority. Even though religious leaders exist, their influence is tempered by the belief that God's perfection is ultimate and beyond human equality. And this means that no individuals, not even the most powerful, can truly claim to be God or redefine what is good and evil for personal benefit. However, in the government's world where God can sometimes make mistakes, that moral foundation disappears. The question of what is morally correct becomes open to human interpretation, and this vacuum of moral authority allows powerful individuals, dominant traditions, or even populist movements to hijack moral narratives for their own interests. And these narratives are hijacked by the wealthy or the politically powerful who use their authority to define what is good and or divine. And this is likely because individuals are not automatically more responsible with interpretation. The government assumes that when divine perfection is removed, people will rationally and thoughtfully develop their own moral frameworks. But in reality, individuals are still bound by misinformation, social pressures, and emotional vulnerabilities. And without the clear standard of divine truth, people are more likely to follow what feels right or what is socially convenient rather than what is morally sound. So in our world, divine perfection acts as a common denominator of morality, a symbol of justice, compassion, and peace that exceeds individual belief systems. And I'm proud to oppose.
Judge, please note that this is a value choice between two models of God, not status quo nitpicks. The opposition's benefits presume that an all-knowing, flawless God would automatically settle morality for everyone. That picture ignores how ethics actually works. Even under claims of perfection, people still disagree in gray zones. Texts still need readers, and readers bring culture, language, and power. History shows divine perfection has been invoked to sanctify oppression, not because perfection guarantees cruelty, but because human interpreters weaponize the banner of perfection to silence dissent. If opposition wants an all-right deity, they must also show that how that perfection coexists with plural moral traditions without gagging them. Moving straight on to clarification then, even granting their claim that a perfect God inspires imitation, notice the price. Agency is traded for obedience. When the ideal is beyond question, the lit message because goodness equals submission to custodians of the text, concentrating authority in clergy and institutions and inviting abuse behind the shield of God's will. By contrast, in our world where God can have errors or even act wrongly, authority is contestable and goodness is argued for, not merely announced. If a God behaves cruelly, people will refuse to follow, and that is actually desirable. We prefer moral goodness over naked authority. A fallible God makes the divine-human relationship conversational rather than imperial. Believers meet a deity who understands limitation, which deepens empathy and legitimizes reform. Opposition will say an always right God produces the least suffering because divine choices beat human ones on average. We answer that least suffering over time comes
from correctability, a system where harms can be named, reasons must be given, and given the divine can be challenged. Perfection filters through fallible gatekeepers, freezes error, fallibility paired with scrutiny fixes it. Moving on to some more direct rebuttals then. She said that a perfect God limits abuse, and leaders are held to a higher moral ceiling. This moral ceiling only works if followers can question authority, but in their world, questioning a perfect God is heresy. The entire structure of religious hierarchy depends on blind faith in divine perfection. History proves that divine perfection is the justification for oppression, not a safeguard against it. In our world, where God can be imperfect, leaders cannot hide behind divine infallibility. Their authority must be earned through transparency and compassion. But two, they directly talk about like without divine absolutism, morality collapses into exploitation by elites. This assumption that only divine absolutism prevents corruption is actually pretty much false. Corruption thrives because divine absolutism silences opposition. Dictators and religious figures have long used God's perfection as an untouchable shield. In our world, when God can have errors, no one can claim ultimate correctness. Power becomes accountable, not absolute. Moving straight on to the last argument coming from proposition then about democracy, moral interpretation over clerical monopoly. Our side is not claiming that all religions are bad. We acknowledge that faith and spirituality can bring comfort, hope, and community. But in the opposition's world, where God is always right, that faith structure easily becomes a tool for abuse and control for the elite. When divine perfection is unquestionable, religious leaders gain unchecked moral power. History shows how this often leads to corruption, hypocrisy, and oppression, not because religion itself is evil, but because absolute power without accountability always leads to harm. In a world where God is believed to be perfect without any flaws, religious authorities claim to be the closest interpreters of that single perfection. This gives them moral monopoly, such as the right to decide what is somehow correct or what is somehow holy in that society. They weaponize guilt, fear, and shame to maintain control over everybody else. Questioning then becomes equivalent to questioning God itself, to questioning perfection. This is where the biggest harm arises. When people cannot question the moral application of God's world, religion stops being a moral compass and becomes a cage. Even harmful traditions such as gender inequality, discrimination, and intolerance towards minorities continue unchallenged because believers are told this is God's will and you must not question it. In our world, on the other hand, moral authority becomes democratic because if God can sometimes be wrong, moral interpretation becomes open and participatory. The believers and leaders alike must engage in dialogue about what is wrong and right. This also makes justice systems more accountable. Without the convenient excuse that something is simply part of God's plan, religious groups and institutions are forced to justify their actions based on reasoning, fairness, and moral transparency. Accountability becomes more likely in our world because believers are encouraged to be skeptical rather than blindly obedient. When God is not viewed as universally or absolutely correct, people have a genuine incentive to question and evaluate divine actions, to ask whether something was done out of fairness or through error. And ultimately, we create a more pluralistic and inclusive world where religious differences are no longer rooted in vague competitions over whose God is more perfect. Instead, open discourse about divine flaws, mistakes, and moral limitations become healthy and productive. This environment reduces abuse, limits moral absolutism, and fosters greater acceptance of diversity and difference. Therefore, it's so proud to propose.
We want a world where God is an entity we can look up and learn from. If God becomes the same as humans, his entire authority, control, and influence weakens. We want a different world. Proud to oppose. Government claims that a perfect God allows religious leaders to abuse moral authority and silence believers is one of their main claims coming from their second speaker. I think abuse stems from human greed, not divine perfection. I think that leaders exploit religion for personal gain regardless of how God is portrayed. But in our world, a perfect God acts as a moral ceiling that limits how far leaders can go. So even when leaders misuse power, the standard of divine perfection becomes a check so that followers can still hold them accountable by comparing their actions in an unchanging moral deal. So in government's world, leaders gain even more freedom to manipulate believers. I think that they can justify wrongdoings as quote-unquote God's imperfection or reinterpret divine mistakes as a validation of their own authority, which is even much worse. I think the rest of the rebels was then be integrated through my speech. Then another rebuttal then, as because the role of a perfect God and accountability beyond the state. The government's world depends entirely on human mechanisms to ensure justice, right? State laws or social norms and moral reasoning. But on our side, we recognize a crucial truth that human systems fail. Governments are corruptible, laws are selective, and empathy is inconsistent. That is why the idea of a perfect God functions as an independent moral overseer, an idea that cannot be bribed, silenced, or politically controlled. So when people believe that someone is watching over them and chase their behavior, even in the absence of state enforcement. So this is the foundation of moral accountability, the sense of guilt or conscience that drives people to not do good because they are watched by the police, but because they're watched by God himself. This belief that is psychologically powerful, it regulates moral behavior across billions of people every day, cutting across legal, cultural, and national boundaries. And it's what makes people donate anonymously, forgive others, or for resist and temptation when no one else is even watching. In government's world, once God becomes fallible, their sacred accountability weakens. Argument 3 then. on the importance of resilience. I think that the perfect God creates a faith that is resilient, one that endures hardship without collapsing into cynicism and despair. When tragedy strikes, people build communities, care for others, and practice forgiveness because they trust that even pain has meaning with a larger divine plan, right? I think that spiritual guidance, however, is fundamentally different from philosophy or science. When reason and evidence can explain how the world works, faith answers the moral and emotional questions that logic, however, cannot do this. So questions about sacrifice or like the meaning of suffering or what happens after death. This is why religions has historically offered people direction in morally ambiguous situations when human understanding has reached this very far limits. So I think that when God is viewed as fallible and capable of these kinds of mistakes, however, I think that this moral and emotional guidance weakens overall because people lose this sense of duty to act righteously even when it is difficult and even when they're in these difficult situations. Without the belief in a perfect being who holds them accountable, individuals prioritize self-interest and justify moral failure with excuses like, I'm only human. The sense of guilt, reflection, and aspiration to do better at the end of the day fades away. Then yes, across history, humanity's greatest acts of compassion and justice have been rooted in belief of divine perfection, that goodness will ultimately triumph, even if it is difficult. Like religious charities, hospitals, education systems were built by those who saw goodness as divine perfection made by human. Civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. rooted their activism in the conviction that divine justice is real and infallible. In contrast, in government's comparative, we see that when God fails, then they internalize hopelessness, right? They stop seeing suffering as a redemptive or purposeful. Instead, they see it as a meaningless error. So in opposition's world, I think that divine perfection gives the most vulnerable, which is the poor, the oppressed, or the forgotten, a reason to endure. So even when justice feels delayed, then they feel like their suffering still carries a meaning and moral significance. And this faith keeps their hope alive and sustains movements that strive for fairness and equality. However, the belief in a perfect God, just God places moral pressure on human institutions. I think that religious groups and social movements call upon governments that act according to divine justice, which is to feed the hungry and protect the weak and uphold fairness because they believe that God demands it. This faith-driven accountability will motivate people to do good beyond self-interest. In contrast, governments will internalize hopelessness because they stop seeing suffering as redemptive or purposeful. Instead, they view it as meaningless error or cosmic neglect. I think that when divine fairness disappears, moral apathy grows. People stop believing that goodness will be rewarded, and the drive for compassion and social changes fade away. This is only leads to great oppression or inequality. We can't live in a world like this. Proud to oppose.
Moving straight on to rebuttals, their deputy claimed that leaders will justify their wrongdoings by saying it was God's mistake. However, please note that this does not directly rebut as any ways in their side. Leaders don't even need to justify their decisions and wrongdoings, as people believe that as God is perfect, their leader's wrongdoing isn't a wrongdoing in the first place. Their side doesn't even need to justify as people already blindly obey. So proud to propose. Then move on to main rebuttals. Then first judge, the opposition exaggerates the coherence of a perfect God, right? Moral ambiguity already exists in their world. Countless sects and interpretations clash, and wars or exclusion or are justified under the perfect scriptures, right? Confusion is not unique on our side. At all. Also, second, their claim about God's fallibility erodes authority is false, right? Our world strengthens accountability and critical reasoning. Believers reflect, emphasize, and take responsibility instead of blindly obeying. The opposition cannot replicate this. Their whole world centralizes authority and stifles moral growth and reform. Also, this debate is not about whether a perfect world creates a flawless God. Would be better. We say that God is always right. We're not imagining a utopia where everyone runs smoothly or where suffering never exists. The question is about two different images of divinity, right? One where God can sometimes make mistakes and one where God is infallible. While both images can coexist across religions and scriptures, this debate assumes a trade-off. One image dominates how people understand and practice their faith. We think this clarification matters because when institutions dominate interpretation, moral boundaries stay blurry, right? We say that opposition must explain how deadlocks are resolved if people cannot question God's actions. Also note that the way God is perceived directly shapes human behavior and societal structures. If God is always perfect, moral authority becomes rigid and people accept divine actions without questions. Ethical reflection is stifled, leaving believers passive and institutions unchecked. After all, then move on to our first clash then. Which side creates a world with more moral reasoning and clarity without blind obedience? So the premise here is, first of all, we say that faith is strongest when it encourages moral reasoning, accountability, and human responsibility rather than just blind obedience, right? We also say that in a world where God is always right, religious institutions exploit divine perfection to demand unquestioned obedience after all. Leaders hide behind the God's will, creating conformity disguised as certain unities, right? And also conversely, when God can err, we say that believers are forced to reflect reflect, reason, and make moral choices as well. And we say moral progress comes from dialogue, critical engagement, and human empathy, not fear of a flawless deity. We told you this happens because moral ambiguity already exists in every religion. A fallible God normalizes questioning, allowing believers to think critically instead of passively obeying divine authority. Also, leaders can no longer exploit perfection to justify oppression after all, right? Also, we say that authority must be earned through transparency and compassion. And lastly, believers connect with God through shared struggles, creating a redemptive, inspiring relationship rather than guilt-driven fear, right? So now rebutting their claims as well, opposition says that role models or guidance must be infallible to inspire humanity. However, note that, Judge, human and moral role models already exist in both sides. What our world adds is exclusive. Divine imperfection teaches humility, reflection, and resilience as a cosmic scale. Lessons no purely human roles model can provide, right? Then move on to the second question about hope, justice, and social accountability, right? First of all, we say that the true test of divinity is how it affects the vulnerable justice system and society morality, like our previous speaker mentioned. So why does this matter then? First of all, we talk about abusive power. We say that divine imperfection and prevents absolute exploitations, and authority is not untouchable after all. And B, about hope for the marginalized. We say that, like you mentioned before, suffering is understood as human, not divine punishment after all. And also C, we talk about accountability, justice, and moral pluralism ensures sustainable, positive societal outcomes. And opposition claims that society would collapse under fallible God, but we say that uncertainty actually strengthens moral reasoning, empathy, and pluralism. And our side is exclusive because opposition's perfect God centralized power, fosters fear, and leaves humans passive, creating moral stagnation. Proud to propose.
The entire premise on government is that God being sometimes wrong would make him more relatable to humans, but it's the opposite. It makes him frightening because of his power. The difference between a human mistake and a divine mistake is scale and permanence. When an all-powerful being commits an error or acts unfairly, no human can correct or resist that act. A single wrong decision from a God has irreversible consequences because humans lack the capacity to challenge or undo divine will. This perception makes believers more likely to fall into despair, not empathy, for a more safe and hopeful world opposed. Clarifications then. Without a moral anchor, morality in government's role becomes conditional and transactional. Government ignores a much deeper consequence where the very foundation of faith and moral belief would change. This does not only affect religious followers, but also societies, philosophies, and governments that base their moral codes on principles rooted in religion rather than just the logic of science. Individuals in their side of the house no longer act out of faith, conviction, or a shared moral duty, but out of convenience, emotion, or self-interest, which is something that we think both sides do not want. Then moving on to two clashes in this debate. Firstly, on believers and their relationship with God, which world creates a healthier, more meaningful relationship between individuals and their faith. So here, government mainly pushes one point. They tell us a lot of things on how a God who is sometimes wrong makes faith more relatable and critical, but we say that there are many layers as to why this is not the case and how we simply outweigh this. First of all, we tell you from our bench how if morality becomes endlessly debatable, people lose the clarity and incentive to act based on stable moral values. Additionally, then we say the semantics of what is good or evil becomes very subjective. Each person can claim that their version of God supports their actions. This doesn't create moral progress, but moral chaos, right? Faith is not about mirroring God's flaws, it's about aspiring to his virtues. A God that shares our mistakes loses his moral authority and stops being a source of inspiration. Spiritual connection is valuable precisely because divinity transcends humanity. Believers seek guidance in what they cannot achieve alone. Compassion, forgiveness, and moral clarity beyond emotion and desire, right? This is why even when people do not understand God's intentions, they still aspire to be good and embody divine traits such as kindness, fairness, and patience to others. In our side of the house, then, even if God is always right, that faith does not translate to blind obedience. It is a test of trust and reflection. People are taught to discern right from wrong within God's frameworks, not to obey thoughtlessly. Moreover, we say that the burden of morality does not just fall on the victims of suffering, it also falls on others who are expected to help because divine perfection carries the expectation that we must act compassionately and justly. Believing that challenges are a test of God builds more moral endurance and faith in goodness because it assumes that humanity is capable of growth and redemption. In governance world where God can make mistakes, this hopeful narrative disappears where progress feels random than earned. Second clash then on the poor and marginalized, which image of God better supports hope, compassion, and resilience for those who suffer the most. Government tells us mainly here how if God can make mistakes, people view suffering as a part of human limitation rather than divine neglect and whatnot. But no, this is simply just not the case. In the government's world, this does not lead to empowerment, but plain apathy. When people think that even God fails, they'll stop believing that justice or redemption are possible on their hand. Their suffering feels much more meaningless than purposeful, right? This mindset further affects governments and institutions because if morality is uncertain and even divine justice fails, states and elites feel less moral pressure to help because people start to think, if God gets it wrong, why should we try to fix what cannot be fixed? At the end of the day, the poor and marginalized lose both faith and drive. If divine fairness does not exist, their motivation to endure and improve faith, which is inherently harmful for all believers that used to act in a moral way due to the faith they have in God as their guidance. Our world is a society and the place that preserves the moral uniqueness of faith and the general belief that goodness has intrinsic value beyond reward or punishment, which is why we have a much better world in the comparative and we are very proud to oppose.
So the government keeps saying that a God who makes mistakes is more relatable and human-like. But think about this carefully. Is that really a good thing? Imagine this. A hurricane destroys your town. In our world, people believe that God must have a reason, even if they don't understand it yet. It gives them hope to rebuild. But in the government's world, people would think God just messed up. He made a mistake and my family died for no reason. How is that comforting? How does that help anyone? When God makes an error, it could affect millions of people and nobody can actually fix it. That's not relatable. That's terrifying. It makes people lose all the hope because if even God can randomly mess up, then nothing in life has real meaning. The government team says Jesus being tempted makes him relatable, but they're missing the point. The story isn't about Jesus making mistakes. It's about him choosing not to make mistakes even when it was really difficult. And that's what makes the story inspiring. If Jesus had given in to temptation, the message would be even God's son fails, which doesn't inspire or motivate anyone. The government claims that when God can be wrong, people think more carefully about right and wrong instead of just obeying. However, in our world, having a perfect God doesn't stop people from thinking. It gives them something to think about. Religious people throughout history have had deep debates and discussions about what God wants and how to interpret his teachings. And having a perfect standard doesn't destroy conversation, it actually focuses it. So in the government's world where God can just be wrong randomly, why would anyone try to figure out what's right? If even God doesn't know for sure, the morality becomes just a personal opinion. One person says God wants us to help the poor. Another says no, God made a mistake there. Nobody can prove who's right. They say this creates democratic morality, but what it really creates is moral chaos. When there is no standard at all, the loudest voice or the most powerful person wins, and that is not democracy, and I'm proud to oppose.
If I were a person who believed in God, but every day I watched cruelty wear a halo and injustice get stamped divine, I wouldn't want a throne that I can't question. I'd want a voice that I'd answer. If I believed but my prayer meant rules that hurt the people I love, I would rather follow goodness than bear authority. If I believed, I choose a God who can be wrong, because a God who can can also listen, learn, and be held to the same moral light we hold ourselves to. That world doesn't make faith smaller, it makes it honest. Tonight, choose the God you can talk back to and the world that suffers less because of it. So proud to propose. But most importantly, let me tell you their flaws and what opposition failed to rebut in this debate. They talk about how the fact that God can make mistakes causes fear, and they also say that us saying God will be relatable doesn't stand as it just causes fear. The rebuttal toward this was already included in everybody's speech, but it's spinning again. In our world where God can be wrong, people realize divine judgment isn't absolute, so there's room for diagnosis and moral decisions. People do not fear God as much since God's decisions are not always correct. What they fear here is a perfect God that they need to follow, since they cannot deny anything. No denial at all means fear. But most importantly, this was not our main stance. We don't get why LO, DLO, and opposite were constantly rebuts against this one single point when our main point was not this. We were talking about manipulation, not reliability. Them saying about moral chaos was also rebutted by speakers. As we told you, that confusion is necessarily harmful, and that is not exclusive. This was also mentioned in PM's preemption. Moving straight on to the main clash then, about which vision of God better reduces suffering while preserving moral agency, an infallible God or a fallible God. An always right God only delivers least suffering in theory. In practice, fallible gatekeepers filter his will, creating monotonous in chaos, flips reality, correcting faith. Speculative civil pieces weaken the democratic moral interpretation, which reforms norms, protects minorities, and enforces accountability. Net The net effect here is a God who can be questioned and corrected produces less suffering and more agency than an untouchable God. Only in this debate, our world builds a faith that inspires reflection, accountability, and real moral growth, something the opposition's perfect God can never achieve. Clear prop ballot, so proud to